Hello, my name is Meredith Beatty, and in this presentation, I will discuss the steps my colleague and I took when going through the instructional design process. With this assignment, I knew right away who I wanted to work with. My fourth grade teammate had been asking me for weeks on ways they could incorporate technology in their classroom. This was the perfect opportunity to get involved in the instructional design process. The first thing we agreed upon was creating a consistent schedule 3 times a week to meet during our lunch period. We got right to work at our first meeting, discussing the different types of learners that were present in their class and what differentiated instruction might look like with technology. My colleague and I knew we needed to narrow down the topic, so we worked together to create a classroom survey to gauge where students were at with their technology use. We needed to determine the comfort level each student had with technology, the programs they were familiar with using, how they would like to see technology used, and give them a chance to share their favorite piece of technology or program. After receiving the students' responses, I created a data analysis report to discuss the findings with my colleague. Since only 60% of the class stated they were comfortable with using technology, I decided to incorporate the SAMR model. I suggested we begin using the substitution level with the SAMR model as a reference to start with tasks such as replacing writing assignments with typing assignments. Through observation, my colleague quickly noticed his students were struggling to type their assignments, which changed our discussions to be centered around typing ability. So in order to understand where their students were and where they needed to be, we needed to consider how we were going to assess students' typing skills. Using a combination of resources and typing programs, we found that beginning typers from ages 6 to 11 should be starting at 15 words per minute with 80% accuracy. Together, we created a pre-assessment through Typing Club, which allotted students 1 minute to type the given sentences, which would assess their words per minute, as well as typing accuracy. We specifically included sentences that used every single letter of the alphabet, so we could better identify student needs and strengths. According to the results of the pre-assessment, we were able to establish each student's baseline score. We noticed as a whole the class did not meet the recommended score for beginning typers. Only 7 out of 18, or 39% of the class, were able to type 15 or more words per minute, and 14 out of 18, or 78%, were typing with an accuracy of 80% or higher. These results showed that students were close to meeting the accuracy goal, but were farther away from meeting their words per minute goal. When we broke down the data even more, we were able to see just how many students were in the below, the beginner, the intermediate, or the expert level with words per minute and accuracy. After looking through the data, I needed to create a needs analysis to determine where my colleague and I would go from there. We needed to consider the goals and objectives for the teacher and the students. The goal of the teacher was to use a variety of strategies to support typing skills. The objectives were having students with one-to-one devices, letting students type their assignments when possible, finding programs to use for typing, and enforcing helpful typing strategies. The goal for the student was that 80% of students would be able to type 15 words per minute with an 80% accuracy. Their objectives were to use the home row keys in correct posture, typing assignments, and using different typing programs. The next step in the instructional design process was to observe my colleague and their classroom, then write up a task analysis that included a procedural analysis, content analysis, and learner analysis. With the procedural analysis portion, my observation included identifying the task my colleague was completing and the lesson paired with the subtask. The tasks I observed were completed during the lesson, but some were completed prior to the lesson. Things I took note of that my colleague was collaborating with me on identifying student needs and setting up student accounts using Typing Club. During the lesson, my colleague handed out materials and began the instruction. They also introduced Typing Club to their students and wrapped up the lesson with a class check-in and discussion. My job as the instructional designer was to go back through my observation notes and create refined steps that could have been included in the task and subtask within the lesson. When it came to identifying the needs of the students, my colleagues seemed to focus more on the whole group, so I suggested focusing on the needs of each individual student and possibly creating focus groups for small group instruction. I thought it was important for them to include the objective of the lesson and identify the goals we want the students to reach with typing. Before the lesson should even begin, the teacher should be modeling correct posture and hand positioning, and also throughout the lesson. The content analysis was essential because it used the notes from the observations to break down the task and subtask even further. It provided the why behind the recommendations that were being made to improve the lesson and interventions. When I made the suggestions to state the objective and explain to students why typing is important, the content analysis allowed me to expand on why that skill might be included in the interventions. I stated that students tend to be more successful if they understand why they're having to complete an activity or assignment. This includes explaining the objective, having a conversation of why skills are needed, and using examples of how typing can be used in everyday life. With every recommendation I gave my colleague, we had a discussion around the topic, and I got to hear their input and opinion as well. This led to a great conversation about goal setting that eventually became part of the teacher and student objectives. My colleague and I discussed on numerous occasions the importance of analyzing each learner. There are so many different components that should be considered when supporting students and creating interventions that are specifically designed for their needs. One of the categories to consider was the information surrounding each student. In my colleague's class, they have 18 students in 4th grade. Some of these students receive several services such as modified curriculum, LLI, AIS, OT, speech, and counseling. Some of these students also have IEPs and 504 plans. Having multiple opportunities to meet with my colleague, I feel like I really got to know their students on another level. We continued these discussions by diving into their students' basic needs, prior knowledge surrounding typing and using a computer, learning preferences, overall attitude around typing, and what motivates them. The task analysis was a helpful part of the instructional design process because it allowed me to see into their classroom with their teaching styles and get to know their kids through observation and discussion. It allowed my colleague and I to create and refine the interventions that were being implemented and make sure they were supporting students in the way that they needed to be. With this new information, we were able to revisit our original teacher and student goals and reflect on the process so far. There were a few changes along the way that we thought would help students become more successful. We changed the overall goal of the teacher to support the delivery of instruction and intervention for all learners to build foundational skills in typing. I also researched new ways to improve the interventions we had and share them with my colleague. This research confirmed some of my previous recommendations, but also introduced new interventions that could support students and their typing skills. Some of the teacher objectives we added, including teaching how to build finger strength and supporting students with goal setting and tracking data. Each objective included a plan of how to make sure the objectives were met. The research we conducted showed us ways to use finger daily exercises to strengthen fingers and help with typing stamina. For setting goals, we made a plan to determine a class-wide goal, but also sit down with each student to create a personal goal based on their pre-assessment data. In order for students to reach their goal, the teacher should model how to track data every time a student completes an assessment. The student goal remained the same. 80% of students will be able to type 15 words per minute with an accuracy of 80%. The same objectives that I just mentioned that were added to the teacher objectives also went under the student objectives, except the students will be the ones to implement these tasks. In this step, my colleague and I had to make sure we were creating tools to collect data through qualitative and quantitative methods. We used research and the help of some of our other teammates who are also interested in joining the process. We created checklists for the finger exercises to hold students accountable by completing them and had a goal sheet for each student, which let them identify their goal with words per minute and accuracy. Students could also track their data using bar graphs with the typing assessments that were completed daily. The tool used for small groups was a chart used to collect anecdotal notes and any further comments on how to support the students. With all of these objectives and assessment tools set in place, my colleagues started using these supports in hopes of building student success. Throughout this time, I would check in with a colleague on how everything was going and make any necessary changes that needed to be made. The evaluation process broke down each objective, the intervention that was used, and the data that was collected, and the results that were found. This part of the process was exciting because we got to see our hard work and interventions and to see if they were showing success. The first intervention that we evaluated was the use of exercise to build finger strength. For the first 5 minutes before any typing activity, students participated in finger warm-ups such as stretches, aerobic exercise, and training. The intention behind this intervention was to build stamina when students are typing so they could type for longer periods of time with more accuracy. Students completed an exercise chart by placing the date on top, then checking off when the exercises were completed. We concluded that these exercises were helpful, but we think in order to show more accurate and consistent results, they would need to be continued past the allotted time of this process. The next intervention we evaluated focused on students setting goals. The intention was for students to be able to see where their starting baseline was from the pre-assessment and create realistic goals in which they could achieve. The intervention paired nicely with tracking data. This intervention paired nicely tracking data because they both went hand in hand with each other. To help support students in reaching their goals, they would need to track their data daily to see where they were with words per minute and typing accuracy. After each lesson, we decided students would take a 1-minute assessment, similar to their original pre-assessment, so they could track their scores in the bar graph. We found both of these interventions to be highly successful because they got students excited about tracking their scores, but also engaged them to work hard on their practice assignments. The last intervention discussed in the instructional design report was the use of small groups. My colleague was noticing that not every student in their class needed the same kind of supports. If someone is trying to differentiate instruction, one of the strategies to use is to create small groups. Students were placed in 4 different groups, which were determined based on their baseline score from their pre-assessment. They were grouped into below, beginner, intermediate, and expert. Certain accommodations were used for students that acquire alternate uses of technology, such as larger keyboards and color-coded key covers. This intervention was determined to be successful because it catered to the needs of each individual learner and helped provide appropriate supports where it was needed, but also challenged students who needed that extra push. This survey was the final part to conclude the instructional design process. Even though my colleague and I found the interventions to be successful, it was imperative to include the thoughts of the students within the process. Students were asked about their opinion on each intervention that was used to increase their words per minute and accuracy with typing. Students rated each intervention on a scale that ranked from not helpful, somewhat helpful, helpful to very helpful. They were also allowed to leave comments about each intervention. Most students ranked finger exercises between somewhat helpful to helpful. Setting goals and tracking data was determined to be helpful or very helpful. Using correct posture and hand position ranked evenly in every rating, and all students found small group instruction to be helpful or very helpful. When asked if they thought they had grown in their typing skills since the process, 17 out of 18 students said yes, while only 1 student said no. My colleague and I both agreed that student voice in this process was one of the most important parts of their journey of designing this curriculum. As my colleague moved forward with this process and instruction on their own, they plan to continue following the steps and use the final typing survey to drive the rest of their instruction. most recent data we collected from the post-assessment showed that 12 out of 18, or 60% of students of the class, are now able to type 15 words or more per minute. That is an increase of 5 students and a 28% increase in typing proficiency. There was also an increase with student accuracy, which shows 16 of 18, or 89% of students, now have a typing accuracy of 80% or higher. The accuracy increased by 2 students who have met the goal with an 11% increase. As we completed the instructional design process, we followed key instructional design principles along the way. The ISTE standards for coaches helped to guide me as I supported my colleague through the mentoring process. The ISTE standard 4.3a focuses on creating a trusting and respectful coaching relationship to encourage educators to explore new instructional strategies. From the beginning of our work together, my colleague and I made sure we developed an open and honest relationship when working together and designing the instruction. We both came to each meeting with new ideas and an open mind. When one of us came up with a new idea, the other person would try to figure out ways to implement the idea and incorporate it into the instruction. I believe this process has brought my colleague and I closer together, and we plan on following the same structure with other areas in our curriculum. The ISTE standard 4.4d focuses on showing how to use the principles of instructional design. From the beginning, I informed my colleague of each step of the process with instructional design so they would be aware of the work that we were going to be doing. We completed each part step by step so each component would build on the next. We developed a safe space where both of us felt safe, trying new things but being okay if we made mistakes along the way. My colleague and I tried to collect as much data as we could in order to track how everything was going for ourselves and the students. We focus on the objectives of both the teacher and students to help guarantee success overall. When an intervention wasn't going as planned, we met up to discuss how we could improve it and worked through a trial and error mentality. We thought assessments were some of the most important pieces of this process, so we continued to assess throughout, such as the beginning with the pre-assessment, in the middle, when students completed assessments and tracked their own data, and in the end with the final post-assessment and the technology survey. Our time together was driven by collecting data and trying new ways to make sure students were successful with their typing. The ISTE standards 4.6a and 4.6b focus on helping to collect and analyze data and helping other educators to read and understand different kinds of data to help support instruction and guide learning. Early on, we discussed how important collecting, analyzing data would be with this work. We knew we would be collecting and interpreting a variety of information using qualitative and quantitative data. The first piece of data we collected was the student survey that focused on their comfort level with technology and familiarity with certain programs. This data led us to decide that our focus would be on increasing typing skills. Once this focus was established, we had students complete a pre-assessment to determine their baseline score with words per minute and accuracy. We continued collecting data throughout as well and taught the kids how to collect their own data. Students were checking off when and what kind of finger exercises they were using to strengthen their fingers for typing. Students set goals and tracked their scores daily on words per minute and accuracy in a bar graph. Small group instruction data was collected through anecdotal notes and observations of each individual learner. These notes helped us to determine what kind of interventions were needed for each student, whether it be more support in certain areas or a challenge. Every meeting my colleague and I had, we discussed the data that had been collected each time, which drove every decision to improve the interventions that were put into place. We were constantly discussing how students were doing and made changes whenever it was necessary. The final information that was collected was the final typing survey to get a full understanding if students found the interventions helpful or not. This also allowed students to have a voice in the matter and leave their own comments about the interventions. At the end of the process, we determined that most of the interventions were successful. and students were able to increase their overall words per minute and typing accuracy. I give credit to the open discussions my colleague and I shared throughout the process and the constant collection